Imagine you're an American like I am and you think, wow, we lead the world in science and technology. I live within easy biking distance of Apple, Tesla, Google, NASA, and Stanford. And yet, this is happening to us. How is this possible? We have great universities and hospitals. We spend so much more on healthcare per capita than any other countries, but we're giving up 8 years of life to countries like Japan? Your mind may be turning to depressing thoughts about fentanyl and gun violence because good doctors are talking about them as real contributors to the problem.
As a doctor, I will tell you that health care only accounts for about 10 to 20% of our health outcomes.
In other countries, fewer and fewer people are dying deaths of despair. Among middle-aged white Americans, however, the opposite is true, with the US seeing a terrifying explosion in opioid overdoses since about 2000.
Gun violence is now the leading cause of death amongst kids in our country, and Dr. Sutton is here to talk more about this.
When we talk about those numbers and you say them out loud and think about the lives that they affect, it makes me speechless.
The Financial Times even went so far as to say, look, 75-year-old Americans are expected to live just as long as 75-year-olds from comparable countries. The problem is all in the youth. I wonder how they would explain this chart showing that Asians in America have life expectancies comparable to the longest-lived countries, while white Americans live 7 years less than them. How would they explain that life expectancy in my zip code is 85 years and it's 20 years less in others? Doesn't that make you ask if the Financial Times chart of 75-year-olds was skewed towards Asian Americans and people in my zip code, because many people in other racial groups and zip codes had already died before making it to 75? I have thought about this problem for many years and have long sought answers from other countries. In my next episode, I'll post a review of Zhang Ji's book, The 111-Year-Old Chinese Nutrition Professor. I'll include a review from Hinohara Shigeaki's book, The 105-Year-Old Japanese Nutrition Professor, whose name I just massacred. Did you know I can read Chinese and Japanese? I can using Google Translate. One of the pillars of the Asian health books I read was having a positive mental attitude. Are we seeing that in many American health books? I'm seeing some rage-inducing titles like Lies My Doctors Told Me and Metabolical. I don't know much about gun violence and drug abuse except they're unthinkably tragic. But I've long wanted to know how big a role nutrition plays and other lifestyle factors. I have 2 questions about that. First, are we Americans caught in collective illusions with our constant obsession about warring diets? No matter what camp you fall into, you have to admit it can't be good for consumers to show up at the bookstore and see one popular book claim the healthiest diet is plant-free, and beside it another popular book claiming the healthiest diet is animal-free. And 2, with all the factors lowering our life expectancy in America, how do Asian Americans live so long? There is another large group of Americans not shown on this chart that live longer than Asians. They are racially diverse, over 30% black. Over 40% of the group live in high mortality states in the South. They're not particularly privileged and they're not eating a lot of Asian food. How do they do it? So part 1, collective illusion. Even I have trouble believing that I have worked across 6 industries in my career. If I didn't have people in my life who were there, even I would have trouble believing it really happened. I believe that is both my strength and my weakness, but it does give me a unique perspective on the collective illusion problem. My first stop was a career in geophysics from the mid-70s through 1990, the period this exceptional book covers called Losing Earth. When I started, scientists were national heroes, and some of the best of them spent the 80s testifying to Congress about global warming, like Carl Sagan and the head of NASA Goddard Space Study Institute, James Hansen.
But the problem is there are effects, and the greenhouse effect is one of them, which have long time constants. If you don't worry about it now, it's too late later on. We are passing on extremely grave problems for our children.
But somehow, in maybe 15 years, the public came to think of climate scientists this way.
They're rooted in lies, all of them. Our next guest was once a climate alarmist, but now says the entire movement is, quote, a scam.
So the question is, why are we still being bullied by these people? It has nothing to do with saving the Earth. They hate the Earth. They hate nature. It's about controlling us.
It wasn't rocket science to understand what Drs. Sagan and Hansen were saying. We knew the basic high school chemistry and arithmetic for over a century. Here's an article about it from Popular Mechanics in 1912. The furnaces of the world are now burning about 2 billion tons of coal a year. It adds about 7 billion tons of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere per year. This tends to make the air a more effective blanket for the Earth and to raise its temperature. The effect may be considerable in a few centuries. They were right about it in 1912, except it only took 1 century. Even in 1912, that was considered old news. But we Americans came to believe completely insane alternatives that caused climate scientists' jaws to drop to the floor. At least the scientists who weren't co-opted into front groups. We just could not make sense of how passionately people believed what seemed to us like collective illusions. My kids could not relate to my career and wanted me to go to work for Steve Jobs, their hero.
Life can be much broader once you discover one simple fact, and that is everything around you that you call life was made up by people that were no smarter than you.
And, stranger than fiction, I did. Keenly aware of the fact that without degrees in electrical engineering or software design, my qualifications were weak. But just like that, I entered a field where the public thought of us as rock stars. The field wasn't plagued with conspiracy theories. People weren't claiming electromagnetic waves were a myth and what's really being used are hidden gamma rays, but people in power didn't want you to know that. In 1993, I went to work for a company called General Magic, and we tried to build what looked exactly like the iPhone 6. It was such a compelling vision that we could hire the best and brightest.
Everybody wanted to be there, and people literally would sleep on the doorstep to try to get an interview or get into the building.
And yet, after a few years of trying, we failed. If I was still in earth science, people would have said, "See, that proves you guys are clowns." But we believed we were simply too early. Electronic components were simply too big and too expensive, and wireless networks weren't ready for us. So many of my coworkers went to Apple and Google and built the iPhone and Android using the lessons learned from General Magic. We were embarrassed about our failure, but 25 years later, we recovered enough to make a documentary about it. It rocketed to #1 on the iTunes documentary store and was the only documentary in in-flight entertainment on airplanes until the Game Changers came along. I am in the film and was asked to answer questions about it from the stage at many film festivals. Me, earth scientist, treated like a Silicon Valley rock star for a failed company? That really broke my brain for a while, but I came up with a hypothesis to explain it to myself. I think if you can align huge corporate interests with deep human desire in an environment of loose regulation, those 3 things, it's like combining sugar, fat, and salt in food and makes people lose their minds. In the case of earth science, we have huge corporations like Exxon aligned with the human passion for fuel-powered things, which I share, combined with the uniquely loose regulatory environment of America. In the case of tech, Apple and Google's interests aligned with everyone's passion for smartphones, boosted by the loose regulations in American tech. Here's the tragic thing. In climate science, the message of the scientist does not align with those 3 things. So the corporations do everything in their power to discredit the scientists and create alternate realities consumers would rather believe. If you go to work for NASA and work on the Hubble or landing on Mars, the public will think you're a rock star. But if you work at NASA on climate science, the public think you don't know what you're talking about, even though your qualifications are the same. The Koch brothers and Exxon will make sure of that. In tech, the message of scientists aligns with corporate interests and human desire. So the corporations celebrate the scientists and lift them up as rock stars. That's true across industries. The Hollywood studios have huge incentives to make icons out of actors like Harrison Ford. In the food industry, the message of science is not what corporations and consumers want to hear. Consumers want to hear that steak and butter are health foods. When food companies see Harrison galloping around on his horse at 80,
you're really on those horses. I heard some of your co-stars said you went fast, like they had to catch up with you.
Well, the horse went fast.
In a hit TV series and mentioning that he's pescatarian, that doesn't sell profitable food.
You attack my family. It's going to be the last thing you ever do.
So you are not going to see Harrison Ford in a milk mustache.
Oh, honey, did you forget? We have Harrison Ford with a milk mustache, and he's looking good.
It says here he did that before becoming pescatarian. He donated the money to charity, and he's since disavowed milk and meat. What are you doing with a Harrison Ford poster? So now the food companies ghost Harrison because they can't criticize a beloved icon. But if a prominent scientist were to promote essentially the same message as Harrison,
what we thought was a good diet was largely vegetarian. fruits and vegetables and fish.
They do their worst with front groups to make up collective illusion fodder about him. I've done several episodes about that. I mentioned that somehow I've worked in 6 industries. My oldest son and I co-founded a business for pro photographers over 20 years ago that currently has more than 100 employees. That awesome print was shot by one of our customers. We started a YouTube channel on photography that could get 1 million views in an episode, and we got to film in planes, on skyscrapers, and in ice caves and get constant accolades. I made YouTubes for my irrational adventure motorcycle passion for a while and also got big views and accolades. But no, I had to go make nutrition videos and align myself with the scientists instead of the corporations. That gets me many fewer views and 100 rage comments per episode. Don't think I don't question that decision every single day.
Oh, honey, are people saying mean things to you in the comment section? Here's a unicorn Band-Aid. It makes the granddaughters feel better.
You talk to any student, what's the worst problem you're facing? Cyberbullies. It's horrible. They can pick on you on the internet. Oh, really? Our generation had real bullies.
Anyway, you get the idea. Combine giant food companies with the burning human desire to believe beef and butter are health foods and you don't need to eat vegetables in a deregulated environment like America, and look what you get. Same as what's happening in Earth science. I could be having so much fun making photography videos while boosting the fortunes of the companies my sons now run. Why do I do this again? Just so the people I love might have fewer health problems, the planet I love might be more livable, and the animals I love might have less horrible lives? Okay, those are decent reasons. If you want a masterclass on how we Americans can be so vulnerable to collective illusions, I recommend the 8-part Hulu docuseries starring Michael Keaton on the opioid crisis. Huge corporate interest from the Sacklers, deep human desire to not be in pain, and the unique deregulated environment in America that made it possible here and almost nowhere else. So part 2, and on to food and lifestyle. The Asian health books I read opened with the importance of positivity and optimism. The Chinese medicine books I read looked like cookbooks. So I interviewed several Asian Americans and filmed one of them. So we're sitting in front of the gates of hell. Why are we sitting in front of the gates of hell?
It's just such an interesting statue, and I wouldn't want to be anywhere else right now, obviously.
I was going to set up on the lawn, boring, and you said, oh no, let's just go to the gates of hell.
Yeah.
Good choice. Your parents are Chinese immigrants, right?
Correct.
So how has that influenced your behavior, your culture, your life?
I think it's influenced everything. Growing up, was quite a rebellious kid, so I always thought, like, my parents can't control me and they have nothing to do with my development, but looking back now, I see how they contributed immensely to the way I view the world, what I eat, how I view everything, my philosophies.
You know the problem I'm trying to understand. How in the world can the life expectancy for Asian Americans be 7 years higher than white Americans?
I'm speaking from the perspective as a Chinese American. This doesn't apply to all Asians, but at least from my personal experience, I think there's 3 main reasons that Asian Americans might live longer than white people or other races in the United States. And it has to do with how they view food, movement, and healthcare. So to start with, for food, in Asian households and Chinese households, food is medicine, and specifically their diet is centered around plants. So growing up for dinner, I could always expect my parents to be whipping up 3 or 4 beautiful, delicious plant dishes, and then maybe 1 meat dish. But meat was always really a garnish rather than the celebration or the main part of the meal. In fact, the only time I really had American food, which was like pizza slices, was when I went to school for lunch. That's what I had pretty much every day.
Was it delicious?
Yeah, and Doritos, so many good things.
You ate a lot of white rice, right?
Yeah, pretty much every meal, which some people would say is the creation of the devil, white rice, but I would say I did pretty okay on it, as did my parents, as do literally millions of Chinese Americans.
It doesn't seem to make that big a difference, does it?
And interestingly, some people say that because of arsenic contamination of rice, some people say the white rice
Especially in the U.S.
Yeah, in the U.S. Some people say the white rice is healthier than the brown rice. Whatever it is, though, yeah. Rice is nice.
So I have these Chinese nutrition books because before I met you, I was trying to figure this out, and I had to translate them into English using Google Translate to figure it out. But I noticed they start off with attitude. They start off with optimism, positivity, and so on. Is that Is that a Chinese thing?
I think it is. I think especially there's an attitude of positivity surrounding aging and longevity and growing up. Some of my friends from other cultures, I've talked to them and they say, well, when you're 50 or you're 60, you're pretty much expected to be decrepit and not able to take care of yourself.
Like me.
Quite the opposite of you. Whereas in Chinese culture, it's always been impressed upon me that people well into their 70s, 80s, 90s, and when they're 100, should be able to walk around unassisted. They should be core members of their family. They're contributing to raising the grandkids. They're not shuffled off to assisted living facilities. Instead, they live with the family and they're all together as a unit.
The U.S. Surgeon General today declared a new public health epidemic in America: loneliness. A new report from his office finds loneliness can have profound effects on mental health as well as heart disease, stroke, and dementia. So your declaration and this report very clearly link loneliness to matters of life or death. To put it plainly, this one number stuck out to me. It found social isolation increases the risk of premature mortality by nearly 30%.
In Chinese culture, elders are respected. They're worshipped. In the family, the little kids are at the bottom of the totem pole and the elderly at the top. They eat first, they have all the respect and veneration, and that's something which is missing from a lot of American culture.
Yeah, I need to move to China. There's several areas in China where there's a lot of centenarians. It's like the blue zones. So I've been reading studies of centenarians in China. And what they say is the secret to longevity is we just eat what we grow.
The very act of growing your own food, cultivating it, gardening has been found to be one of the cornerstones of those blue zones populations. And I think in Chinese culture too, just gardening, like you said, eating what you grow is so important. Chinese culture also has an emphasis on fresh food rather than processed. In fact, my grandparents, after we picked vegetables and we cooked them for one meal, they would tell me to not put it back in the fridge. They would say, Michelle, finish your vegetables because we're not going to put them in the fridge. Once they're in the fridge, they're bad. That's already too old and contaminated. And that shocked me, but that's the level of, attention to freshness they had.
I also read in those Chinese blue zones that they put vegetables at the center of every meal. Including breakfast. It's the center of breakfast, center of lunch, center of dinner.
Yeah.
Did you practice that in your family? Or?
Yes, I did. So initially when I was growing up, I had pretty standard American breakfast fare of cereal and Spam and eggs. But then when I was in middle school, my dad told me that he had read somewhere, it might have been in a Chinese nutrition book, that sweet potatoes are really good for you. And then from that day on, every morning I got freshly steamed sweet potatoes for breakfast. And then I went to school and had my, pizza and my Doritos, so good at the time. However, then at dinner I would again have healthy Chinese food.
So you said there's a tradition of walking after meals?
Yeah. So there's actually this Chinese proverb which goes, 饭后百步走，能活99. And what it means is, if you take 100 steps after eating, you'll live to be 99. And the reason it's 99 instead of 100 that you would live to is because if you use 100 in that saying, it doesn't rhyme anymore, it doesn't sound as good.
Oh, really?
But the point is, if you walk after eating, you can enhance your longevity. And my parents certainly practiced that. After every dinner we had, we would walk around the neighborhood together. And the research even shows that walking after eating promotes healthy digestion and helps regulate your blood sugar after a meal. So it turns out the Chinese had something right.
Yeah, they did. In America, we fill up, on Thanksgiving or Christmas or whatever, and then we just want to lie down. Is there a culture for not filling up too?
Yeah, definitely. They've talked about how in the blue zones in Okinawa, there's a saying called hara hachibu, which means eat till 80% full. And in Chinese culture, it's the same way, where you're admonished for being overindulgent, and instead it's always good to exercise temperance when ingesting any kind of meal. What is considered dessert in Chinese culture is fruit. Like Chinese New Year, lots of mandarin oranges everywhere. That's the dessert. And I never realized it was strange that Chinese people don't really have dessert until one of my friends from a different culture asked me, how come when I go to a Chinese restaurant, they never serve dessert at the end? Like, I don't get cheesecake, I don't get what? And I thought about it, I'm like, I guess you're right. We don't really eat dessert. What we snack on are fruits and nuts, and beverages are water and tea, so.
What about eating rate? You mentioned chopsticks and...
Yeah, so traditional American utensils like forks, spoons, they obviously were designed to make eating a lot faster and easier. The Chinese, I guess, were just masochistic, but we decided that we like eating with chopsticks. And chopsticks take a little bit more dexterity, and you can't quite shovel in the same volume of rice in with chopsticks as you can with a spoon or a fork. And even the dishes themselves tend to just be smaller, the plates and the bowls.
Eating together?
Eating together, yeah. Communal meals, I think, are so important in terms of also slowing down that eating rate, because you're talking, you're eating at the same time. I think people, when they binge on food, they're much more likely to do it when they're alone and can shove 20 cookies in their mouth, versus when you're with your family, it might be a little more socially inappropriate to do so. If you eat at, say, a Chinese restaurant, you'll often sit at a table where all the dishes are shared. They're put in that center and you rotate the table, and there's just something so nice and convivial about that.
What do you know about other Asians? South Koreans, Japanese, Indians?
Yeah, I would say I think they also have food that's primarily plant-based. Perhaps if you look at what they're eating now, it might be more meat and dairy heavy, but that's largely due to Western influence. If you say look at Indian culture, Ayurvedic food, that's all completely plant-based. And they like the Chinese, Ayurveda itself is seeing food as medicine, like turmeric and spices. Just they've always valued them for both the taste and the medicinal properties of them.
It seems so ironic to me that here's a culture that's thousands of years old that has been relying on plants for medicine because of their healing properties for so long. And then you have modern Americans on the internet saying plants are poison. You know, they're toxic and they're trying to kill you. And it's like, where'd you come up with that? And how long have you believed that? And how long have we tested that for longevity? The Chinese have, Asian cultures have, you know, all over the world. And
yeah.
So there are about 50 Asian cultures that are sort of defined as Asian.
Filipinos were not even full Asian. The government didn't know we were. They just put us in an Asian category. We're actually a mix. We're half Asian and half Latino.
Can you think of any that aren't plant dominant?
I really can't. If I think about having visited places, their menus, what they're serving, not really.
From the continent of India, they seem to cook with a little more cream, or it doesn't seem quite as healthy.
Yeah, so in India they'll use ghee, which is clarified butter, and they often will use a lot of dairy. So most Chinese people, are lactose intolerant. We don't have any dairy at all. But I think Indians can probably metabolize it a little better because they've had it in their culture for longer. I mean, growing up, I certainly had a lot of dairy milk, despite being lactose intolerant, because my parents, having fled communist China, had grown up being taught that, you know, milk, dairy were precious. These were the most expensive items. And so coming to America, they saw it as being able to provide me these items as a luxury. And they wanted me to grow, you know, bigger and taller, which didn't really work out, but they really wanted it.
That's probably a good thing.
Yeah.
I understand the risk factor, and I'm 6'4", so I always read that the risk factor for cancer grows as you get taller. There's just more tissue.
Yeah.
You know, more tissue, more risk. What else about Asian culture should we talk about that we haven't touched on?
Oh, I could talk about movement. I
yeah,
could expound a little more about that. So in Chinese culture, if you go to China, in the morning if you walk around, you'll see a lot of people, especially the elderly, outside practicing Tai Chi or Qigong. You'll see that. And then in the evening, if you walk around outside, you'll again see a lot of people, primarily elderly people, doing stuff like line dancing. And if you flip on the TV, there's a lot of programs which show people doing jumping jacks and calisthenic movements. This is just all part of the culture, having movement throughout your day. And of course, it happens too when people are gardening, tending to their homes. So there's just this general culture of having moderate activity throughout the day, which we don't see as much in America. In American life, we know it's more about perhaps people will get their really intense CrossFit session in the morning for 1 hour, spend then the 8 hours and all that time after that just sitting.
Yeah, you know, I almost suggested that we walk around campus, because I like to walk when I film, just for movement. But here we are sitting and talking about movement. What else should we talk about?
Yeah, I think also I want people to know about the Asian attitude toward healthcare. So America, as we know, has more of a sick care system where doctors are paid more to perform surgeries and prescribe pills. Whereas, at least in traditional Chinese medicine, It's all about prevention. In fact, in ancient Chinese culture, doctors were paid only if their patients stayed well. When the patients got sick, they weren't paid. And the doctors who performed surgeries were actually looked down upon because they were seen as those who were actually unable to keep their patients well. Many Chinese children, including me, can remember that as we were growing up, whenever you got sick, our parents would deny us the Tylenol at first grasp, and instead they would concoct these horrible, horrible tasting concoctions called zhongyao, which is Chinese medicine, which is basically plant and herb concoctions. Again, they tasted nasty, but they worked.
So the other people who live long in America are Seventh-day Adventists, who live 3 or 4 years longer than Asian Americans and may now be the longest-lived population on Earth, right here in America, many of them scattered across many high-mortality states. When I've mentioned them in the past, I haven't seen anybody question whether they really do live that long, because death records are hard to fake, but I have seen many theories on how they do it. One is it must be their religion, which discourages smoking and drinking, same as Mormons. But even Mormon nutrition professors say Mormons have higher rates of obesity, diabetes, and mortality. I did an episode on that.
Members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints are not spared from the plagues of prosperity, these chronic diseases that stem from insulin resistance. In fact, evidence suggests we may suffer from them more than members of other religions.
And there are studies comparing Adventists to other non-smoking or drinking Americans, and Adventist mortality was still dramatically lower. They're encouraged to make the main part of their diets, vegetables, fruits, beans, whole grains, and nuts, in as close to their natural state as possible. But some people say it can't be that because there are plenty of studies of populations that include vegetarians who fare no better than meat eaters. For example, scientists behind the respected 45 and up study in Australia published a paper noting no differences in mortality between meat eaters and vegetarians in New South Wales. But they also pointed out that most of the vegetarians in their study were eating a lot of refined carbohydrates. In other words, replacing meat with refined carbohydrates confers no benefits. I don't think that's a good look for either refined carbohydrates or meat. The difference with the Adventist studies is they stress eating plants as close to their natural state as possible. Another argument is it's their religious beliefs, not their diet. But if that were true, why do Adventists who lean harder into vegetarian and vegan diets have dramatically better health outcomes than Adventists who don't? Same religion, they do share some important habits with Asians.
Lydia, just such a sense of enthusiasm and passion for life. At 110 years of age, she was getting around on her own. She would go out and eat at restaurants a couple of times a week, and she had this marvelous sense of humor. And that's one of the things I've discovered, and which I'm not going to be talking about today. The positive optimism and sense of humor that does make a difference with our quality of life. In all of the centenarians that I've interviewed, they all have that quality.
So how is it possible that they live so much longer than even Asian Americans? I think it's because over time, Asians tend to drift towards Western habits, like Michelle mentioned eating pizza and Doritos. But that's not what happens in Adventist culture.
It's very interesting as we looked here in terms of age and dietary status. And you notice very clearly that the older our population becomes, the more they tend towards a plant-based diet. Some because they have chosen that way right from the beginning, but others they have switched later in life to more of a vegetarian diet.
And why is that? Maybe it's because Adventists are growing very quickly and it takes time for new members to adjust to a more vegetarian diet. Or maybe after they're exposed to a lifetime of Adventist teachings and they come in touch with their mortality as they age, they pay closer attention. I'm guessing, I really don't know.
And 99% of our population are practicing meatless days.
Michelle pointed me to the best-selling nutrition book lists in China, and it's pretty impressive. Several of them are deep multi-volume sets. I didn't see any that looked like the fad diets that plague America. So in a nation obsessed with fast food, how are these two groups able to resist what is happening to low life expectancy groups in America?
People here have 2 or 3 jobs to pay the rent, to pay for a Metro card. You know, they don't have time to cook home. You have the McDonald's right there. You have the Subway, fried chicken. Then you can go get a coffee or a donut, Dunkin' Donuts. If you're still hungry, you can go to the Wendy's right there.
My guess is both groups are so steeped in the traditions of their cultures that they're more able to resist all the fad diets that keep resurfacing. And that probably helps them resist fast food, especially Adventists, because they're so exposed over the years to healthy eating as part of their religion. Adventists share the same exercise ethic that Asians do, by the way. So what is my conclusion from this episode? Opioids, gun violence, loneliness, rage, no health care for the poor, and the influence of the food companies really are killing us. But the great news is we have these two groups who are showing us how to live long and thrive right here in America, and it isn't rocket science. Positivity, exercise, plant-dominant diets, and getting involved in positive communities. Isn't that awesome news?
Have you seen this? Hallmark has a line of birthday cards now for people turning 100. How many of those do you think they sell in a week? Those cannot be flying off the shelf. And if you have to buy a card for somebody's turn 100, put that off to the last minute.